Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and I've got all different kinds of worms. The most common worm I think used for vermicomposting or worm composting are the red wigglers, the Cadillac of worms. There's European night crawlers, they're pretty popular. African night crawlers, they're a little bit sensitive to cold, so some people in cooler climates steer clear of using the African night crawlers, but they're a great worm to use as well. And then there's this pretty commonly used mix of red worms. I call it the mixed red worms. That's European night crawlers, red wigglers, and blue worms, Indian blue worms. And I've got one bin in which I've got that mix of red worms living. It's this tray over here. It's a 220-day-old system. Last checked it on 10 days ago. I got some other stats about it on my little green information board, so I'll share those with you before we get started. So let's get a glove on, get the system up on the bench, and get to feeding them. Once again, like I did last time, I'm wearing not only my blue glove, but I've also got this fairly skin-colored glove on as well, because I want to do the same thing we did last time, which is to get a little bit more hands-on with the material in here, and I'll explain that in a moment. But here, really quick, before we get started, I've got the foods that I plan on giving them. I've got a fairly good quantity of used coffee here and some pear, I believe this is. Some stuff handed off to me by my mom yesterday when I went over there for dinner. And the green information board that I made reference to is right here. I think we already mentioned the age, 220 days of age, and possibly the period of time that has lapsed since the last check-in 10 days ago. 18 feedings so far. Today's feeding is going to be number 19. One thing that's not depicted here on the information board is the phase that this system is in, because normally when I launch off a system, everyday check-ins, which consist of adding food and bedding and moisture and grit and whatever else the worms might need at the time, is the typical routine. But at some point when I start getting to a point where I feel like the system is maturing to the point where I might want to think about harvesting their castings and move the worms onto a fresh new place, or maybe I'm just running out of space in the container, whatever the motivation might be, I'll start withholding the application of bedding, which has been going on now here for the past 34 days. And the whole idea behind that is that we just give them a chance to work down all the stuff that still lingers in the system as leftovers from the most recent, the last application of bedding, which at this point will go back almost 5 weeks. And that's what I call foraging, or fed foraging, really. In the past, I used to consider foraging as just leaving the worms with nothing new, not even food, but I sort of changed over to a thing that I've coined the expression fed foraging for. So the fed obviously indicates that they're still getting fed, despite the fact that no new bedding is getting applied. And I guess I'll still reserve the option to do full-blown foraging where nothing new gets added, but most recently I've been transitioning my systems from everyday composting to fed foraging to try to promote the breakdown of residual material in the system so that we can start gearing up for migration, or whatever method I choose to separate the worms from their vermicompost. And the other thing we did during the last check-in was we converted the layout of the system. I think that was mentioned on the green information board too, from just feeding in different places, and here we fed here and there and everywhere, and we decided it was time to switch over to this continuous flow type system. Oh man, it's so weird using both hands. I figured we would start aerating the material and just loosening stuff up in general while I'm chit-chatting here. And the whole idea behind that was that it sort of had a twofold thought process. I figured we would set up the edge, start getting the worms to gravitate towards one side of the bin allowing them to leave behind the stuff that's more mature and finalized for the most part. But since we're fed foraging, my idea for replenishing the feeding each time was to not come in with new bedding, since we're fed foraging now, but to utilize a lot of the material that this system was made up of, which is some of this fairly thick twine, and moving all that stuff over to the feeding zone, or not all of it, because even last time I spent maybe 10 minutes collecting some of the stuff, but not just moving it over there, but also unraveling this rope to make it less, what's the word, I guess, in my mind, when this stuff is twisted up tight like this, the way it is, the stuff that's inside at the core of the rope is not really accessible to worm traffic, only the outer surface is, which seems like, you know, a large percentage of the material is simply inactive from a worm composting perspective. Seems a little counterproductive. So it seems to me like if we're able to unravel a handful of material each time we check in here and use that as bedding in the feeding zone over on that side, then we're keeping to the idea of fed foraging and not adding new bedding. But we're also making bedding available to ourselves. And it's available, you know, I mean, it's there, but by unraveling it, it just seems like it has a much greater likelihood of breaking down more quickly, and becoming much more available to worms, for the worms to utilize as bedding. So here's a piece of full-size twine that has not been unraveled yet. I found that if I unravel once, like so, it releases 3 strands, which individually can also, in the opposite twist, or untwist at this point, can be opened up into 3 more thinner segments. And I can even see a little tiny worm that did actually make itself into the twine in between the wrapped individual strands. And it's pretty wild how this stuff just breaks now at this point from me tugging on it, from being soaked and by being in the worm bin, and I guess just the general breakdown process is occurring alongside the worms actually eating it. I'm sure there's a lot of other microbial activity and fungi and who knows what else working this material down. So my idea here was to just spend a little time unraveling some of this stuff. Doesn't have to be a lot, and I also have to take into account the fact that the stuff that I collected here, once it gets unraveled, is going to increase in its volume. Not necessarily, just it's going to take up more space because there will be a lot more air within it now, with all the material sort of unbound and released from itself. So I think the stuff that I collected from the far edge is going to be a satisfactory collection of stuff that I can now proceed to unwinding, but I expect that that might take a few minutes. So I think I'm going to just run the camera, or the video footage, back for you guys at a somewhat faster pace, just so we can get through the somewhat mundane activity of me trying to open this stuff up to make it into a much more interesting and useful bedding material to include in our feeding over on the other edge. So why don't I get to doing that now, and I'll just shut my mouth and see how much of this I can get taken care of in as little time as possible. Wow, that was something else right there. I was able to take this fairly long piece because it seemed like unraveling it would be a chore, and I was able to just tug on a little bit and it broke. No sweat. So this stuff is much more fragile than I thought it was at this point. So I just figured I'd mention that really quick. It might have been clear on the video already, so perhaps my explanation of it was unnecessary, but it did surprise me a little bit, so I figured I'd just mention what I saw there, and now I guess we can get back to getting this stuff unwound and ready for use. Alright, so I think we've gotten to the point where we've kind of worked down all of this gathered twine from its twisted, larger form into what you see here, unwound to a certain point. You might have even seen me here and there taking one of these smaller sizes and even going further to just sort of tear the strands apart from each other. At that point, there's not like multiple strands twisted around anymore. It's just individual fibers all kind of stuck together there. And now I think we can make our way over into the feeding zone, which was marked with a couple of these feeding zone indicators. I usually use coffee filters or something like that to show where we last fed. And you know, since I got a whole stack of coffee filters off on the side, I'm thinking instead of trying to reuse these, maybe we'll just add a new one. But you know, that would kind of go against the whole idea of no new bedding, right? So why don't we just reverse what I said there. We'll set one of these or two of these aside so they can once again be draped out across the top of the feeding zone over there on the edge to show us where we last fed. I mean, it was actually a bit difficult to see where the last feeding was because the stuff had already kind of taken on the form of the neighboring materials. No, not form, the color, the appearance of it. But I think we'll be alright. We won't get lost. We'll find our way back to the feeding zone next time, no problem. So over here you can still see good bits of the full-size twine over here. We'll get back to doing this in future check-ins. I figured over the course of maybe 3 or 4 or however many check-ins it takes, we could probably eventually ooh, there's some of the food that we gave them last time. We could probably kind of work down all of the really thick, large pieces into really fine material that probably has a far greater chance of breaking down quickly. So we'll continue doing this. Do the 2-glove approach, spend a little time ripping large bits apart into smaller fragments, and using that as our bedding rather than trying to come in here with fresh bedding. And that'll help us keep to the whole concept of the fed foraging. So I'm definitely finding leftovers. The last check-in only 10 days ago, I thought that it was materials that would go quite quickly. Oh, you know, but you know what it is? Here again, it's now I'm getting the reality of it. I see a lot of stuff. It makes me think, oh my goodness, they're still working on it. Did we come in here too soon? No, I don't think so. Because I believe that the majority of the stuff that we gave them last time were fragments of lettuce and things that I knew would go within a matter of just a couple days, but there were also a few other things that I can now identify from their scent. Citrus, which just by its nature is going to take a little bit longer, and there's even some onion here, which perhaps also is a slightly slower composting material. Onion I've only just recently started collecting and adding to my supply of frozen foods for the worms, because in the past I always treated onion as one of those no-no foods along with citrus and other things, and that stuff would always go out into my compost barrel. And more recently I've been thinking, hey, why not? We'll just increase the variety, start giving them those things that I would normally steer clear of and not treat them as taboo. So that's the reason we're doing that. So let's take this little opening we created down here and plop in all this terrific repurposed rope, which is now just gonna probably serve as a nice bedding for the wormies. I hope. That's the whole idea. I've got some pumpkin stem in here. We could throw the leftovers back in, give them the time they need to get to the finish line, and then in can come the delicious pear that we had for them. So I showed what it was that we were feeding, but I didn't identify it. It's just a bunch of pear, mainly pear skins, you know, peel. But I think there was even a couple pieces of pear in there that were just rejects, maybe bruised or not as good as they could have been. So So now I'm left with the quandary of getting their food in there in such a way that I don't make a mess using my soiled hands. So this is where perhaps I can get creative and use some of these bits of food to get some of this gook off my hands and start gravitating towards only using the blue glove and maybe doing my best to release some of the stuff adhering to the skin colored glove off there so that I don't have to resort to some sort of crazy contortion to manipulate my camera to turn it off. Well, you know what? Doesn't matter. We're going to be washing everything here anyway, so I don't have to go crazy trying to keep things clean. That's a pretty nice feeding. At first I thought it might be not much, but I think it is a pretty good amount. Here you can see some of these larger chunks that were probably bruised and considered as reject. So let's just take that larger piece and separate it into 2 chunks. This stuff I suspect is not going to last. That's just my gut feeling, but I could be wrong. And all this larger stuff, this might be stuff that we would, at some point in the near future, would want to consider breaking apart further, but you know, I'm not going to try to get too caught up in how we're going to accomplish this as if it were some sort of critical goal. We're just going to, I guess, restore what we found over there, bring that stuff back in as sort of top cover, and just by being there in vicinity of the foods and stuff, hopefully it'll be exposed to some worm traffic and get worked down nicely. So these were the things we wanted to preserve and utilize as feeding zone indicators, but before we do that, I'm just going to attempt to level things off here. Things are kind of riding high in here, approaching the rim of the container. So I think it's a good idea that we're not adding anything, but by taking the existing material that's really densely, tightly wound upon itself, the rope, and now opening it all up, it fluffs it all up so much that it really takes up a lot more space. So we'll have to do this carefully so as to not suddenly expand a bunch of tightly wound material into so much material that we start overflowing in here. But that to me looks like a pretty good setup, if you ask me. And now I think we can just come on in here. You know, I had coffee. I totally spaced on putting it in here. No big deal. We're just going to skip it at this point. I even had my grid on the ready, even my worm chow. I had all these things on the ready, but I guess I'm so busy running my mouth, I just totally spaced out on doing that. Now I'm getting dirty, getting things dirty here that have been cleaned for years. Oh well. Shows how much experience I have using 2 dirty hands here. I'm so used to having a clean glove. I mean a dirty hand with the glove and a clean hand on reserve to do other things. So whatever. Maybe I'll learn. I don't think we're going to be doing 2 glove stuff very much, but in here, to achieve the objective of tearing some of that thick, dense twine to pieces, it does seem like the best way to go. Alright everyone, that's it for the check-in. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Well, normally I would haul this away, put it back on the shelf, but I think I'll save that for later too once I'm cleaned up. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.